So Mary Bennet in Pride and Prejudice is a little bit of a square, super religious, always giving someone a sermon about something. Or is she? What if secretly she is intellectually enlightened and considering running off with a guy to Italy to become his mistress and shack up with him? Which is the real Mary Bennet? Now, if you have no clue what I'm talking about, then you probably have not been keeping up with the latest episodes of the BBC's new miniseries, The Other Bennet Sister, which follows Mary Bennet on her continuing adventures after the end of Pride and Prejudice. Now, this series, of course, raises some very, very important questions about Mary's core character and the nature of Regency-era society itself, which we are going to be delving into here in today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So if you're not familiar with The Other Bennet Sister, then definitely check out some past videos I've done. I have a whole video on the original book this series is based upon, as well as some on the series itself. But what I really want to delve into here in today's video is one of the most significant changes that this series has made. And that, my friends, is the taking religion out of Regency society. The Mary Bennet of The Other Bennet Sister has been highly secularized, as has Regency culture in general. So if you've seen my video before on gender roles, then you know that we've talked about just how religious the Regency was. This one was one of the major pillars of how they viewed reality. And it can be hard for us as modern readers to even conceive of the level of religion that drenched every single aspect of their lives. A girl in her everyday life would be going to church, they would be praying at home, she would be reading novels where the heroines were Christians, teaching her good morals, she picked up a magazine. The magazine was not how to get hot abs before summer, it included articles like how virtue adds to a young lady's charms. So something else you probably wouldn't find too often in a Regency-era magazine was articles about serious women's health issues like menopause. So lately, I've been having the strangest range of symptoms, from my skin drying out to my periods changing to just insomnia. It's really started to affect my work. I've been having such a hard time focusing or being motivated to do anything. And I've tried all of these little lifestyle tweaks, but nothing was really helping. And then I was talking to my friend about it, and she said, that sounds like perimenopause, because she's recently gone through it. And I was so overwhelmed when she said that. I was like, but I'm too young for that. Anyway, then things got even scarier for me when she was telling me her experience, which was that she went to a clinic where the doctors had no clue how to treat it, which makes sense because about 80% of OBGYNs do not have training in menopause, which is why I'm so incredibly thankful to this video's sponsor, MIDI Health. So MIDI is a virtual clinic founded by women that specializes in women's health, including menopause, weight management, and longevity. They are here to actually listen and help you understand what is happening in your body and offer solutions. They can order blood work, prescribe medications, and bill insurance just like any provider. And I'm so incredibly thankful to them for helping me have a completely different experience than my friend. I was able to have my virtual visit with my clinician who explained what was happening and how, even though I am younger than average, every woman's body is different. And it just helped me feel so much less overwhelmed. And they were really knowledgeable and explained different treatment options I had to help smooth this transition. And I was able to go pick up a prescription at my local pharmacy later that day. So if you are interested in visiting with a clinician who actually understands women's health, then definitely go to trymidi.com/Ellie Dashwood to schedule a virtual visit and join the more than 200,000 women who love and trust MIDI. Now, back to the video. Now, something else that can be a struggle for modern readers is often the fact that Christianity, as a lot of people know it today, is significantly different from the Christianity that Jane Austen and her characters would have practiced, not just in their doctrinal beliefs, but also things such as morality and whether it is okay or not to sleep with someone outside of marriage. However, for those in the Regency era, their version of Christianity was not only super real to them, but also super important. And this was true especially for Jane Austen. She was highly religious herself, and as we talked about in the clergy video, her father was literally a clergyman. Her brothers were clergymen. Her nephews would grow up to be clergymen. Her cousins were clergymen. She was friends with clergymen. She read sermons and discussed them with her family on a regular basis. And so Jane Austen herself was sort of the epitome of a woman who was raised with religion as being one of the defining pillars of her reality. And we see this reflected very, very clearly in her writings across all of her books. Now, of course, some of her characters are super religious, some of them are almost irreligious, but what we do see is that religion is a important character factor for every single one of them. Now, for example, if we look at Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, she is clearly a very religious character. When her cousin elopes with Henry Crawford, she is just so shocked. She is just so overwhelmed that it makes her physically ill. Meanwhile, we also see Anne over in Persuasion being very religious. She is judging Mr. Elliot for traveling on Sunday. However, even if we look at Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, a lot of people wouldn't immediately think of her and think, wow, she's super religious. However, it is an underlying factor in her core personality. And in fact, like we talk about in the recent Honor video, when she is analyzing Mr. Darcy and his personality, she specifically thinks about the fact that she doesn't know anything about him that is irreligious or immoral, and that is important to her. So basically, Jane Austen and all of her heroines viewed life from this Regency Christian moral perspective. Now, what does all of this have to do with the Other Bennet Sister? Well, basically, in the series, we see a very interesting moral issue pop up for Mary Bennet. Basically, she has become good friends with this guy named Ryder, who's a little bit of a free spirit, definitely a libertine. And basically, he's like, hey, you want to go to Italy with me? And this is where it's very interesting because in the original novel, this scene is a little bit more subtle. The way that Ryder, asks her to go to Italy with him is so ambiguous that at first Mary thinks that he's proposing marriage, and so she turns him down very kindly. However, when she's thinking about it later, she's like, wait a second, he never actually asked me to marry him in that whole speech he did. I think he just was asking me to go be his mistress in Italy. Here is what she thinks about his proposition. Mr. Ryder would have described his offer as a partnership of like-minded spirits, emancipated from tired old customs, living free and independent under sunny skies amongst poets and artists in a world where only emotions mattered. Now, when I was reading this scene in the original novel, something definitely stood out to me, and that was the fact that once Mary realized the fact that this guy was actually asking her to be his mistress, she does not respond to this like it is a religious moral issue, and she does not take the righteous offense to morals that a Jane Austen heroine would traditionally do. She is not like, oh, that is just this massive sin / crime / terrible thing that he's proposing. Rather, her reaction sort of centers around offense to her own self-worth and also the fear of losing reputation in society. So here in the book, we've already seen religion being removed as one of the major pillars of Mary's reality. Instead, it is much more about self-love and self-preservation in the world. However, in the book, Mary still does not consider this proposition at all and immediately shuts this down once she realized what he actually meant. However, the TV series takes this to the next level. So in episode 7, they have this whole scene with Mr. Ryder, only they have him sort of come out and spell his proposition in clearer terms, so Mary much more quickly realizes that he's asking her to pretty much run off and be his mistress in Italy. Now, what's so fascinating about the way they have Mary reacting is that, again, she does not come from this immediate religious moral place. Rather, we see her genuinely considering running off and just living with Mr. Ryder. I think one of the most interesting scenes so far in this entire series is later that night when Mary is getting ready for bed and Elizabeth comes in to wish her good night. And this is when she confides in Elizabeth the fact that she's had this offer to run off to Italy. And Elizabeth, of course, immediately reacts like this is a terrible idea, that marriage is a woman's only protection in this era, and that Mary's reputation will be ruined, and that Mary just deserves better. Meanwhile, Mary is still genuinely unsure. She is thinking, well, maybe like a less common life is what I'm meant for because I'm just not like everybody else. However, once again, we see religion and Regency morality not enter the conversation. Never once does Elizabeth just say, that would be morally wrong. That is a sin. You need to maintain your virtue. God would disapprove. Instead, the entire conversation is more centered around, again, Mary needing to value herself more, she deserves better, and also the fact that Regency society would look down upon it. Again, this is more like social survival, society's opinion that matters. But can we actually be sure that Jane Austen would have viewed this situation as a moral and religious issue as opposed to just a social one? Was Jane Austen more like, well, you can't elope because then, society will shun you, versus you can't elope because it is wrong? Well, I will tell you, Jane Austen actually weighed in on a very similar issue happening in Mansfield Park. So, of course, Mansfield Park is probably Jane Austen's most religious book. This was very heavy on social commentary. It talks a lot about the fashionable morals that are sort of coming out of London that are represented by Mary and Henry Crawford in the story. And basically, Mary Crawford tends to view the world much more like we see both Elizabeth and Mary doing in this new series. She pretty much sees eloping as a bad idea because it brings social consequences, not because it's actually morally wrong. Now, this is, of course, super fascinating because it shows us that Jane Austen was aware that there was a subset of people in England who did view elopements this way. They did view sex outside of marriage as a primarily social issue if it got out, as opposed to a religious or moral one. And this is something she has the character Edmund react very, very strongly to. Again, Edmund is sort of like the clergyman. He's like the really Christian righteous guy. And when he's talking to Mary Crawford, and when she calls her brother's elopement folly, or basically stupidity, and a social issue that needs to be hushed up, here is how Edmund Bertram reacts to her choice of words and the way she is viewing it. Guess what I must have felt to hear the woman whom no harsher name than folly given, so voluntarily, so freely, so coolly to canvass it. No reluctance, no horror, no feminine, shall I say, no modest loathings. This is what the world does. For where, Fanny, shall we find a woman whom nature had so richly endowed? Spoilt. So here Edmund is basically like this woman, nature richly endowed her, like Mary Crawford is just so gifted and so smart. But here, she's literally acting like an elopement is nothing but stupidity. Right? That's all? She's not over there this is a grave moral sin? In fact, later Edmund adds this, that the manner in which she treated the dreadful crime committed by her brother and my sister, but the manner in which she spoke of the crime itself, giving it every reproach but the right, considering its ill consequences only as they were to be braved or overborne by a defiance of decency and impudence in wrong, and last of all, and above all, recommending to us a compliance, a compromise, an acquiescence in the continuance of sin by having Maria stay with her brother on the chance of a marriage? So here again, we see Edmund calling this a dreadful crime and a sin, and what he's upset about is the fact that Mary Crawford is acting like it's not, right? He's like, you have left the religious factor out of this entire conversation, and in fact, you want her, my sister, to continue to live with your brother in sin? Just so we can more easily sort of socially hush this up? How am I supposed to agree to that? Not only that, but Edmund is also very concerned about the fact that Mary Crawford has no feminine, modest loathing towards even speaking about this elopement, right? Because of course, Fanny, she's overwhelmed. She can barely talk about this to anybody. Mary is over there just being like, yeah, like totally, this is such an issue. Let me like openly talk about it. And Edmund's like, how can you even dare talk about it? Like, you should just be like, this is so indelicate. I cannot speak upon the subject. So I think this is actually a perfect example of one of the things that has changed between Regency Christianity and a lot of modern Christianity today. So if you ask the average person, what does it mean to be modest? You'd probably get a lot of response of not wearing super revealing clothing, right? Not dressing too sexily, maybe. Now, that was an important aspect of Regency era modesty as well. However, it was a much, much more intense concept. So Regency modesty actually had two important aspects to it. One was respect for the boundaries God has established, and the other is respect for oneself and others. So basically, it's all about boundaries and respect. So if we look at the clothing example again, from a Regency perspective, they would not wear revealing clothing because God condemns unchasteness, right? And they need to be chaste, thereby the boundary. However, a woman also obeys this boundary because she respects herself, right? She's like, I am too awesome to ever do anything unchaste. However, this concept in the Regency era applied to far, far more than what clothing a woman would wear. So, for example, imagine you are a young lady sitting in an opera box, right? And you're just watching the opera when your gentleman friend leans over and whispers something indelicate in your ear. That is correct. He has just broke the boundary of chasteness. Now, how does a woman respond? Well, with modest loathings, right? She's immediately like, righteous indignation. My self-respect is hurt because you think that I would ever break this boundary and I am too awesome to be unchaste and thereby you are a loser. So if you're ever reading a classic novel and something triggers that response in a lady where she's immediately like, I am offended by like whatever moral indelicacy just happened in front of me, that is what it is. That is her modesty kicking into effect. Now, this was seen as a major protection for women of the era, because if a guy can't even whisper something indelicate to her without her reacting with righteous indignation, then she is definitely not going to go sleep with him. So basically what Edmund is saying here is that Mary Crawford's modesty should be so keen that she should just be so abhorred by any breaking of the boundaries that she should not even want to be able to discuss her brother's elopement this freely. However, we just see Mary over there very deficient in Regency era modesty. She can be over there discussing another couple sleeping together and she's totally fine about it. This is very, very shocking indeed. Now, however, let us bring this back to the Other Bennet Sister. So, from Jane Austen's perspective, how should Mary have reacted the second writer offered her the position of mistress? With utter indignation and righteous anger, and immediately leaving him and never talking to him again. I'm sorry, but Mary in the Other Bennet Sister is seriously lacking some modest loathing. Yep. Zero modest loathing. However, someone might be like, Edmund, he's a little bit extreme. He's super religious. Would a more like low-key religious character, a more subtle person, agree with him on this? Well, for that, let us turn to looking at how Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice reacts to Lydia's elopement. So, of course, as soon as she hears of the elopement, she gathers up her aunt and uncle and they start heading back to Longbourn. And as they're doing that, they're discussing this. And her aunt and uncle are like, can this even be true? Like, surely, Lydia couldn't have really eloped, right? And here is how Elizabeth responds. It does seem, and it is most shocking indeed, replied Elizabeth with tears in her eyes, that a sister's sense of decency and virtue in such a point should admit of doubt. So here we see Elizabeth responding with issues of virtue and decency. These are very religious words in the time period. Basically, Lizzie's like, yeah, it is very shocking for us to even consider the idea of Lydia lacking religious virtue. Now, what's so very interesting, if you've seen my video on what is Mary Bennet's purpose in life, we talk about how Mary is actually even more religious than Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth looks pretty moderately religious in the book just because Mary is over there being even more religious, and by contrast, Lizzie looks less. In fact, throughout Pride and Prejudice, we see Mary's name consistently coupled with the word morals. So, for example, we hear that they found Mary, as usual, deep in the study of thorough base and human nature, and had some extracts to admire, and some new observations of threadbare morality to listen to. Later we hear, Mary, however, continued to console herself with such kind of moral extractions from the evil before them. Then the very last thing we hear about Mary is Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and she was necessarily drawn from the pursuit of accomplishments by Mrs. Bennet's being quite unable to sit alone. Mary was obliged to mix more with the world, but she could still moralize over every morning visit. So here Jane Austen has made being interested in morality one of the core aspects of Mary Bennet's personality. So if we bring all of this back once again to the scene in the Other Bennet Sister where Mary is discussing with Elizabeth whether she should run off and be Mr. Ryder's mistress, we see how far these characters have been changed from their originals. Elizabeth would have cared very much about the virtue and decency of her sister. Meanwhile, Mary, entire personality is based off of religious morality. Again, let us remember that a lady cannot be too guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the other sex. And when we see Elizabeth reacting the same exact way, we see that this is an issue that is not just Mary specific, but they are changing the way Regency era society is viewing this issue as a whole. There's no one really in this series stepping in and having this religious aspect. Basically, they are giving us a Regency era where nobody cares about religion. Now, of course, I didn't write the show, so I can't tell you exactly what the BBC was thinking. However, I can give you my theory, and that is that it makes the show much easier for people to relate to if they rewrite Regency reality to more closely match modern reality. One of the number one things people struggle with when they first start reading Pride and Prejudice is the fact that they thought so differently back then. It is hard to sort of wrap one's head around a completely different society and worldview, especially because their form of Christianity was often so different and also so much more intense than what a lot of people are used to today. So basically, here are some stats on this. According to the UK Office for National Statistics, for the first time in a census of England and Wales, less than half of the population described themselves as Christian, a 13.1 percentage point decrease from 59.3% in 2011. So basically, British society has fallen only to about 50% Christianity, and according to the Pew Research Center, of that 50% who are Christian, only about 6% of them pray daily in England, meaning that we have a far, far less religiously intense society than they did in the Regency era. The big issue of changing Regency society to match our modern perspective more is that it requires a rewrite of history. So to help us understand why this is such an issue, let us talk about a different topic, which is, of course, money. Let us imagine it's 200 years from now, and in 200 years, somehow maybe replicators from Star Trek have been developed, and kind of like in Star Trek, we've developed a society where people really don't have money, and poverty has been eradicated. So in this futuristic society, when someone goes to make an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, how is anyone going to relate to it? Right? So much of Pride and Prejudice revolves around money, whether we're talking about Mr. Darcy's £10,000, the fact that Elizabeth and her sister are going to be poor when Mr. Bennet dies. I mean, even Mr. Wickham's motivation for trying to elope with Georgiana is her dowry. However, if in 200 years they decide that that is no longer relatable, are they simply going to make a Pride and Prejudice version without money? And how on earth are they going to be able to achieve that? Are they going to do the same thing that pretty much the Other Bennet Sisters did, where instead of having religion be the issue with the elopement, they took the weight off of religion and they put it over onto social reputation and disapproval? So are they going to somehow be able to shift the importance that money plays in the story onto something else? Are they going to have to find the social equivalent of Mr. Darcy's £10,000 that is relatable to their society, whether that is some sort of status or achievement level? So if in 200 years we do end up with moneyless Pride and Prejudice, first of all, what does this even do to Pride and Prejudice, the story, right? At what point does Pride and Prejudice stop being Pride and Prejudice? How much can we change it until it breaks? But also, on the other hand, how much can we rewrite history in our own image before we completely lose the conception of how people thought historically? Like, if we are constantly rewriting history to be more like ourselves, then how are we supposed to understand the actual past? So, of course, historical events were caused by historical decisions that were caused by historical ways of thinking. But if the main media we're taking in is presenting the way people thought in the past as the same as we think today, then the decisions stop making sense. Now, you might be like, Ellie, I think you're forgetting the fact that this is just supposed to be a fun movie. And I think this raises the question of what responsibility do period dramas have? Like, are they entirely just there for entertainment, or do they have some responsibility in how they present the past and in historical education? And this is not a question I feel like I actually have an answer to. I feel like there's lots of questions in this video I don't actually have an answer to. But I do think that whether we like it or not, period dramas do play a very vital role in historical education, in that that is where people are drawing their ideas from the past about. Like, just for example, how many of us, the main narrative we have in our heads about the Titanic is the movie Titanic. Now, of course, there are actual nonfiction books you can get about the Titanic. I have a whole video, actually, on how to take a first-class trip on the Titanic, which was actually really fun to make, guys. You guys should check it out if you haven't seen it yet. However, I would say that for a lot of people in the world, their idea of the class system, of how life was on the Titanic, and so much more comes directly from watching that movie. So likewise, as adaptations of Pride and Prejudice are made, more and more people's view of what the Regency era world was like is going to be based off of the movies. Which again, if these adaptations become less and less like the Regency era and more reflective of our own selves, then at what point do we just completely lose all of our historical understanding? So let us bring this all back to the Other Bennet Sister. That scene of Mary and Elizabeth discussing whether Mary is going to elope might seem just like a good dramatic moment in the series, but it requires a massive rewrite of Regency era society. And this just raises so many questions, like where is the future of Pride and Prejudice adaptations even going? And at what point do we lose complete connection with historical reality? And these are questions I have no answers to, guys. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. And also, special shout out to all of my channel members. Hey, thank you so much for being my awesome channel members. And as always, guys, keep being awesome, because you're awesome. Bye.